Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Danny Haig, Assistant Director at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Today, we'll discuss CSET research on the potential for reinforcement learning to support cyber defense. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator. Dr. Melody Wolk is a machine learning researcher at Apple. She works on applied and theoretical security research problems, primarily in the realms of cyber defense and security automation. Prior to joining Apple, Melody worked at Vectra AI. She published several papers, mostly focusing on the application of reinforcement learning in the cybersecurity domain. Melody received her PhD in astrophysics from the Institute of Astrophysics in Paris. Melody, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Danny. I'm going to now introduce our speakers for today. So our first speaker is Krystal Jackson. She's a visiting junior fellow through Open Philanthropies Technology Fellowship at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she works on the Cyber AI project. Prior to that, she was a Public Interest Technology Fellow at Carnegie Mellon University and a Youth Organizing Fellow with Americans United. Her research interests include the impact and future direction of weaponized AI, governance strategies for reducing the risk from advanced technologies, ethics of technology, and methods for a value-sensitive design. Krystal holds a master's in information security policy and management and a BA in ethics, history, and public policy, both from Carnegie Mellon University. Our other speaker is Andrew Lohn. He's a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where he works on the Cyber AI project. Prior to that, he was an information scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he led research focusing mainly on security and artificial intelligence. Prior to that, Andrew worked in material science and nanotechnology at Sandia National Laboratories, NASA, Hewlett Packard Labs, and a few startup companies. He has published in a variety of fields, and his work has been covered in MIT Technology Review, Gizmodo, Foreign Policy, and BBC. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from UC Santa Cruz and a bachelor in engineering from McMaster University. And now to our speaker.
Thanks, Melody. Today, we're going to talk about uplifting cyber defense, how new training tools can help improve defenses. And this piece of work, next slide, please, is mostly based on a recent report that came out just this week. It was a collaborative work with our friends at CTAS, part of the Turing Institute, Anna Neck and Ant Burke. So I'd like to thank them up front and then throughout the whole briefing. And we'd also like to say that this work was only possible because of help from Sasha Babuta and John Bansimer, who helped make this coordinated effort come together. Next slide. And so the bottom line up front for this whole presentation is that autonomous cyber defenses that can not only detect threats, but that can also engage in defensive measures are still in their early days, but that they're promising and worthy of sustained investment. Now, along these lines, we'll talk about the background on reinforcement learning and autonomous cyber defenses. We'll go through the research questions and methodologies that we use, and then present some of the findings and results, and wrap up with considerations of both the technological ones and some policy considerations and challenges. Finally, a few recommendations that we've come to through this report. Next slide. So at about 4 a.m. Kiev time on May 24th, Vladimir Putin started his special military operations speech. But by the end of that speech, half an hour later, there were airstrikes in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Dnipro, and ground troops had started their long slog from Belarus to Kiev. But the special military operation had already started before that. The night before, just a few minutes before the close of business day in Kiev time, new wiper malware showed up across the country. It was detected almost immediately. Within only an hour and a half, ESET had already posted to Twitter how it works and indicators of compromise. within another hour and a half of that, news had spread widely enough that it had been given an unofficial name that's been continued, hermetic wiper. And this was all really quick work. It's an excellent example of coordination between governments and industry. But was any of that really fast enough for the targets in this case? Well, we don't know about that exactly. Maybe some people out in the audience do know the details. But we do know that 22 destructive wiper incidents occurred in the first week and then 0 in the second. So for the first tranche of targets, it may not have been quick enough. And then still, a month into the conflict, there were hermetic wiper wiping events that were destroying computers still in the country. Now, for years, there's been a lot of work on detection for AI, but there's been much less detection in other areas. Detection is just one fraction of AI. As you can see from this representation of the NIST cybersecurity framework, detection in the lower right there. But also there's identification. This is understanding your vulnerabilities, understanding the threat environment. There's protection. These are things like adjusting the configurations to make them more safe, or selecting and administering patches to promote in your network. There's response. These are things like choosing how and when to isolate endpoints, or and recovery. There's like how to remove an intruder or remove a foothold that they've established. Now, each of these other stages is a bit more iterative than the detect mode, and so it lends itself more to a different type of artificial intelligence than detect might. I'd like to leave it to Krystal to start talking about reinforcement learning.
Thank you, Drew. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on reinforcement learning and autonomous cyber defense, but to set the stage, first I thought I'd talk about the game Go. So for decades, the strongest Go computer programs could only play at the level of human amateurs. Standard machine learning methods, which test all possible moves and positions, can't handle the sheer number of possible actions and evaluate the strength of each possible board position in a timely manner. But in 2016, things started to change. DeepMind showcased the strength of AlphaGo, the first computer program able to defeat a professional human Go player. AlphaGo went on to win against the #1 Go player in the world at the time, and its successor, AlphaZero, is arguably the strongest Go player in history. They were able to train these programs using 2 key pieces of insight from AI: reinforcement learning joined with deep learning. This demonstration really highlighted the power of these 2 techniques to learn complicated games. It was notable at the time that some of the moves suggested by these programs were unintuitive and counter traditional Go playing wisdom. This led developers in other fields to wonder what new moves or possibilities were out there that computers could find that humans could not. Cybersecurity can be thought of as a kind of game as well, one between defenders and attackers of computer networks. In the cyber defense context, the goal of applying reinforcement learning is to find some of those novel moves, as well as respond at the speed and scale of cyber attacks. We explored the application of reinforcement learning to the creation of cyber defense agents that are capable of making a series of good security decisions under uncertainty. These agents would be trained by taking a certain base model or algorithm, a set of actions that it has available to it, such as restoring a system from backup or using a tool to scan an incoming file for malicious code, and perform these actions in a simulated environment that would mimic the real-world environment that we hope to deploy it in. These actions are rewarded, and updated information about performance is fed back to the agent so it can learn and adjust its behavior to find the right kind of responses to different threat scenarios and attacks. After training and meeting certain performance metrics, it would then be deployed to the real-world context. But before I continue, I'd like to highlight the work we did to define what exactly autonomous cyber defense is. To understand how to move development forward, we want to clarify our vision of ACD, what it should include, and just as importantly, what it should not include. One important distinction in general is between automation, which relies on explicit instructions and well-defined scenarios, from autonomy, which aims to develop a kind of intelligent agent with the ability to take in new information and respond dynamically to changes in its environment. So in summary, we are defining autonomous cyber defense systems as systems capable of protecting organizations and users through system hardening, network and endpoint management, threat detection, and intrusion response and recovery without direct human tasking. Autonomous cyber defense systems independently compose and implement safe, proportionate, and effective courses of action to accomplish goals based on observation, knowledge, and understanding of the world. While this definition is very broad and certainly up for debate, we felt it was useful in framing our particular analysis. So the next question is, why study this topic now? Conceptions of autonomous cyber defense have been around for decades, evolving in part from multi-agent systems research. And we thought it was an interesting time to study this because previous work on developing autonomous cyber defense agents was rather secluded to a small group of specialized researchers, in part a limitation due to the lack of software and infrastructure needed for these tasks. Virtualizing networks has its own set of specific specialized software that is not easily integrated with popular machine learning libraries, and creating a larger training to deployment pipeline using these tools is somewhat cumbersome. That changed when OpenAI released GIM, again around this 2016 period, which is a library that allows for simulation and emulation environments that interface with reinforcement learning agents in an easy and customizable way. We can see the change and other development tools, made over time from when reinforcement learning was sparsely used for game playing to more recently when GIMs have been taken up by the cybersecurity research community, which has led to several open source and closed source projects building a foundation for autonomous cyber defense GIMs. We also credit the development of better GPUs, cloud computing access, and algorithms as well, but focus on these open source GIMs as a kind of catalyst for broader machine learning and cybersecurity community to expand techniques outside the fields that had focused on reinforcement learning traditionally, like robotics. So in short, these new reinforcement learning tools that have cropped up have given us a new opportunity to rapidly train, test, and modify reinforcement learning cyber defense agents. So now into the research itself. So to better understand what the space looks like right now and what developments could be made to advance the field, we asked 4 research questions and employed a few methodologies. Our first research question was, what is the current state of the art in autonomous cyber defense? Second, what are potential visions for future autonomous cyber defense? Third, what are the challenges in achieving those visions? And fourth, what actions can be taken to accelerate progress towards autonomous cyber defense? To answer these questions, we conducted 2 different literature reviews. The first review looked at publications on autonomous cyber defense in great detail from the past 3 years. And the second review used an AI platform and text embeddings to find semantically similar publications from the past 23 years on these topics to get a better understanding of the field over time. Our colleagues at CTAS conducted expert interviews to understand what these experts thought about our 4 research questions. And here at CSET, we took the lead on analyzing the state of the art in open GIMs that were publicly available, delved deeper into the papers and the code that was available for these GIMs, all to gather some insights. So now I will just briefly discuss some of the main results of our research, noting that the bulk of our findings are covered in the report. So first, overview of the space. There's been a sharp increase in the number of publications in this specific area of reinforcement learning for autonomous cyber defense. Again, we see that the sudden interest in the field correlates with the development of some complex cyber GIMs in the past 2 years or so. Some of the papers that are published are still on algorithms, but many of the papers that we looked at are researchers that are able to test different theories. We saw demonstrations where a research group would mock up a basic environment to test their game theoretic setups. And so the GIMs have many applications here. You'll see on the right that this is the list of some of the GIMs that we examined in greater detail. We chose these GIMs based on their uniqueness, state-of-the-art features, and relevance to the policy space. And we came away with a few general takeaways from looking at these GIMs. The main one is that there is still room for growth. Across all of the gyms that we closely examined, we found that many of the techniques that are from MITRE's ATT&CK framework and actions from the OpenCE2 framework were not covered. These frameworks aim to represent the actions defenders and adversaries perform, and while not a perfect encapsulation of those jobs, highlight that there is a gap between current capabilities performed and these gyms. As a result, an area that is really ripe for development is simply expanding on the tools and actions that the defensive agents can take for a popular gym environment. And similarly, the adversarial agents are somewhat limited. Although some gyms employ outside tools that emulate a variety of behaviors, for instance, in the Saigil gym, this is still an area that could be developed further. Our research, though, primarily looked at Cyborg, the Cyber Operations Research Gym, which was developed and maintained by the CAGE Working Group. So we chose this gym for a few reasons, because of its complexity, being one of the most advanced up there, along with Microsoft's BattleSim. It also focused on training defensive agents, which was of interest to us. It had significance to the international community as a jointly developed project, and because it solicited submissions from research groups around the world for competitions on various autonomous cyber defense challenges. The challenge that we studied most closely was CAGE 2 competition, and we highlight later, but we think that hosting competitions is definitely one piece of growing the field overall that we'd like to see different groups continue in the future. So now just to look at the expert interviews, one thing that stood out from these interviews was the importance of the human, funnily enough, while talking about autonomous systems. Our experts felt that frameworks for human-machine teaming were essential for advancing the field in a way that is both safe and trustworthy. They also felt that establishing standards for testing these systems before deployment and continuous monitoring was vital. And the third and most important insight was that there needed to be information and skill sharing across different stakeholder groups to realize the true benefits of this technology. And that looks like open exchanges across academia, industry, and government on things like best practices, also highlighting one of the other ideas that came up quite frequently, like data access and sharing, sharing information about training gyms, etc. So now I'll hand it back to Drew to talk about technical and policy considerations.
Thanks, Krystal. We can go to the next slide. And so in our report, we cover a range of technical challenges that might come up. I'll just touch on a couple here for time considerations. One is just the complexity of cybersecurity can be a challenge in and of itself. And you can think about that in the combinatorial explosion. How many different actions or observations might there be? You can imagine if you just had 10 pieces of software, or sorry, 10 endpoints, that each had 10 pieces of software, that each had 10 configurations, now you have 1,000 things to observe or change. The types of the gyms that exist can have many different things covered, but the scale of agents that we were observing, at least in the open source, we're looking at the range of maybe 50 actions and observations, things that they're monitoring and things that they're able to do. Now the systems like AlphaGo or the video game playing reinforcement learning agents from like the 2016 type of time frame, were capable of much more. They get into the tens of thousands of observations or actions potentially. Moving to those larger, more complex spaces, action spaces or observation spaces, requires more complicated and larger neural networks. And those larger neural networks require more computation to be able to manage. Now, the AlphaGo or video game playing systems from nearly 10 years ago now required a lot more computation than what the agents we're seeing in cybersecurity require today. But those two are much smaller than the types of cutting edge neural networks that we see trained out there. The AlphaGo networks are about 1,000 or order of 1,000 or tens of thousands smaller than GPT-3, which itself is several years old now. But aside from even building these agents, there are other technical challenges. Even defining what it is they should do is not exactly clear. You can say we want them to defend the network, but that's not a specific enough goal. What we need are things like to understand how much reward to provide for isolating attackers, but also how much punishment for making a mistake and locking out legitimate users. And sometimes these can be in tension, as in that case, or is it more important to keep the service up or to prevent data loss? Now, this technical challenge also blurs into policy challenges, and we mentioned several of those. Next slide, please. The most commonly referenced one, as Krystal mentioned, was involved human-machine teaming. With autonomous agents, that doesn't mean that humans are completely written out. They just change what their role is. And understanding what that role should be is itself a challenge for policymakers. How much autonomy do you provide to these autonomous cyber systems? That's a difficult question. You may not want them to be able to shut off the service without a human's approval. But if you get to a point where the human bureaucracy about providing those approvals is the bottleneck, then maybe the autonomous agent isn't running any faster than the human anyway. Coming up with what sort of levels of task should be allowed is its own policy challenge. You can imagine it kind of like the levels for self-driving cars, where certain tasks are allowed at various levels of testing and performance demonstrations. Those tasks might be separated based on things like the complexity of the task being performed and the potential impact if it goes wrong. Now, this changing role for humans highlights the idea of replacement of workers, and this is something to be considered. But also, humans are pretty stable here. First of all, there's a big skills gap, and so some help from autonomous systems is mostly welcomed. We were just at the RSA conference, and in these huge 1,000-people auditoriums, several people were talking about autonomous systems and autonomy and ChatGPT and things like this for cyber defense. And they polled the group of several times, who's here is worried about losing their job to AI, and out of thousands of people, maybe a handful of people raise their hands. It's not that much of a concern now, but it's something to think about. How do we change the jobs that we have in order to accommodate autonomous systems like this? And then in order to get to a point where we even have these autonomous systems to start asking those questions with, it's pretty important to have a sustained funding. That way people can take bigger bets with their careers. Next slide. And so in summary, we have two recommendations, basically: to nurture the field and to guide the field. Nurture the field involves things that try to make sure that we continue to make progress on autonomous defenses. Guide the field is about making sure that the progress is aligned with our broader goals. Nurturing the field are things like invest in scaling the gyms and the agents, providing data that we might need in order to make sure that these environments are realistic, developing and retaining talent, and then, as Krystal mentioned, hosting the competitions. Guiding the field, understanding like which things are risky and which things are beneficial to develop. Along those lines, it's not entirely clear yet whether it's possible to make defensive agents without also creating similarly capable offensive agents, which could be a dangerous proposition. As we mentioned before, understanding the thresholds for authorization, making sure that these agents don't cause mistakes more than they help, and then just setting the priorities for ACD agents. Which types of defenses are more valuable? Are we focused more on understanding on avoiding exfiltration, or on shutting down services, things like that? And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much to our speakers. Please post your questions in the chat. And as questions start rolling over, I'm going to ask like one question so people can just get started. So I think that was very interesting. Thank you. One thing that I have thought about a lot is, you mentioned like more gyms and more agents. And I was wondering, like, to you both, what's the next iteration of gyms like Cyborg or Cyber Battle Sim will need to be really useful in more production environment settings, like in real case scenario, because so far they're very abstracted. So what, according to you, would be required for them to like go to the next level?
Sure, I can start with that. And Krystal, you can have an answer afterwards if you want. One of the things, the gyms are capable of a lot of things, it seems. Some of them are closed source and held by defense or intelligence agencies that we can't look into, but others are open. And I think that they're highly capable. What I noticed in these competitions, the gyms would be capable of many things, and the contestants would shrink the things that they had to observe and the actions that they could take. And so the agents actually are limiting more than the gyms right now, it seems, but those agents can be expanded out to include those other aspects. They just need to have a more complex use case, and they need to have and be willing to invest a little bit more computing and training. From the gym side, what I think would be really interesting, there are a variety of things, but I think a nice first step would be to make more complex and realistic adversaries. So not actually changing what the gym is capable of itself, but what the simulated attackers learn how to do or decide what to do in there. That might require a little bit more data sharing about what do attackers do in the real world, so that we can figure out what simulated attackers should do in the gyms.
Yeah, and just to add on a little bit to that, I definitely thought it was very interesting as well that a lot of the competition submissions would basically constrain the observation space that they were using for training. And so they were not even taking all the information that is provided by the gyms, as Drew said. So I think that, that piece definitely, but also there's this piece where there's a lot of user traffic that is not really accurately represented. So there's usually so much on like an enterprise network that is going on, so many devices, a million users doing a million things. And so like accurately representing that as the noise or the background, because it is very difficult a lot of times to distinguish true signals from all of that noise. So generating more of that data could be really useful as well.
Thank you both. That makes a lot of sense. So we start having some questions. So I'm gonna start. The first one was, if government agencies are still not adopting generative AI, how do you suggest to go about exploring more generative AI in government jobs to make more effective use of the technology?
Well, I think that there probably is a fair amount of generative AI being adopted at various levels throughout government, just people using it to help do their job or do brainstorming or to summarize memos. And I imagine that it's happening all around. But I think that that the jury is still out on how risky it is to use generative AI for many things. From the standpoint of writing code, we know that it can introduce vulnerabilities that some researchers at NYU and Stanford have shown these types of things. And so I think there's still a lot of testing that I would like to have done before I would recommend actions to promote use of generative AI in any critical system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you say a little bit more about what you think the action space for agents should be like? Should it be a collection of discrete actions or something more complex?
I can take a first stab at that. There are many different visions here. And I'll talk a little bit about the range of visions and then say a little bit about what I think is coming. You can imagine one monster agent that is able to observe everything in your network and able to take all of the actions that a human defender could take. That type of agent might be unwieldy in terms of the computing capacity required and the amount of data that needs to be sent around. But it would have a lot of contextual knowledge to make really high quality complex decisions. Other agents are a different model to have many different agents that each can control various parts of this problem and can pass information across each other. Like maybe you have one agent that sits on endpoints, and it says, I'm observing these types of behaviors, I'm going to take these actions, and I'm going to pass that information up. And so then that gets passed up to something that maybe covers your network. And it's a completely different agent that can maybe not remove malware or kill processes like the endpoint one could, but can control the firewall and say which types of traffic can be sent across. That other agent would also be able to understand what are we seeing these types of behaviors across many endpoints? Did we see a likely phishing email on endpoint 3, and now we're seeing this other strange behavior on endpoint 5, and try to coordinate those actions. So you can imagine actions like kill processes or inform other agents, set firewall rules, adjust configurations, lock out users, all sorts of things like this.
Yeah, and just to add on, I would probably just echo what Drew said in terms of like the conception that seems most promising to me, both for cost reasons, complexity reasons, would be this kind of multi-agent approach. We saw even in some of our analysis of the winning competitions that people employed this kind of thing where they had a controller and then different agents that activated based off of what they were observing initially in the environment. So it seems like at least a somewhat promising approach.
Yeah, thank you. There was a couple of questions about the fundamental understanding of deep learning and what it's doing, like kind of the black box problem. So how do we make sure that the results from the reinforcement learning agent are better understood in the cybersecurity context, and so like increase like trust, for example?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this one. I think that trustworthiness is such an important issue in this domain or any that involves autonomy. And it's a really difficult question. There's so much research being done right now on explainable AI. And while there are some innovations in the space that help understand the relationship between actions and pieces of the network and why an agent may have behaved the way it did, it's always going to be a challenge to fully understand the reasoning there because of the complexity of the networks and so forth. And so I think that part of it is trying to employ the best explainability methods that we have, and then also coming up with specific standards or metrics for testing that we can assess these agents against so that we can see that they're reliable over time. I think that's our first good stab at it.
Yeah, I agree. I think testing is going to be paramount here. And I think that you can phase it in. Like there's certainly a lot of autonomy that exists today. Certain like downloads will be blocked and you have to approve those. Users can be locked out after several passwords or wrong passwords or something like this. Those can be disruptive to productivity, but they're not the worst things that can happen. If you give agents the ability to wipe a user's computer, which is something that defensively they might need to do, that could be a bit more invasive. If you take down services that could break service level agreements, that can be another level. And so I think it'll just be a matter of starting with the things that you can tolerate failures on, testing them for a long time, understanding how those work, understanding how they can be attacked or manipulated by attackers, and then stepping up through there.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And a kind of related question, like, do you think these kind of autonomous security tools will be able to meet like controls and requirements that are mandated by, for example, federal agencies?
That's a hard question. Like certainly for some tasks they will, and for others maybe we'll never get there. For some, maybe they already even do some of the very simple automated ones. And so drawing a line between automated and autonomous, where basically automated are things that you can prescribe, you know exactly what it will do under certain circumstances, but it does it itself. This is like after 3 missed passwords, then it locks you out. You know exactly what that's going to do. Autonomous might be lock a user out if they have some strange behavior, but you haven't specified exactly which strange behavior would make it do that. And so that there's kind of a jump between those two, but I think that for some tasks it will be easy to allow for federal agencies to allow, and for others maybe not so much.
Yeah, and I just want to precise, thanks Ben for reminding me, but the question was, I think, specifically about like NIST, like you know, like the requirement from mandated by the NIST. Sorry for the pronunciation. Yeah. So. Krystal, do you want to add something to that?
The only thing that I would add is that as we start to add this like new generation of tools, some of these requirements might need to be adapted to kind of account for autonomous actions, kind of to touch on something that we were talking about before with like self-driving vehicles. You know, as these new technologies come about, new standards have to be invented or standards have to be modified to account for the fact that these systems have some level of autonomy. So this could also be something that we see at the NIST level or other frameworks.
Yeah, and a tangential question to that, that is like touching on, you know, how the field of technology like cyber and AI is fast evolving. And in parallel, we have a relatively slow legislation effort in all these areas. You mentioned also safe driving cars, so we kind of see like the same issue here. So how should policy framework be designed to be flexible for to take into account the potential future advancements of like, you know, like ACDs, for example?
Yeah, there are kind of two different models that I think about in terms of legislating in critical systems, legislating AI in critical systems. There's like the aviation model, and there's a self-driving cars model. Where the aviation model, very little comes in because they've got these super high thresholds for what's allowed and what their failure rates are, and you need to be able to demonstrate those things before you send a plane up. Autonomous vehicles have been a lot more open about. We'll send them out on the road and see what happens. And there have been fatalities, and we're starting to try to deal with them and understand what the rule should be. How reliable are these systems actually? I suspect that in the cyber world, we'll be closer to the self-driving car situation, or maybe even more tolerant with it there. But I think that we should try to make it clear which systems we can tolerate those types of failures on, and which ones we can't. We don't allow the aviation ones because those failures lead to a whole different scale of deaths. And there are a variety of critical systems in the cyber realm that could be pretty devastating to have failures in. Others are just a bad day. And so I think that we'll have to divide it out by sector within cybersecurity.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Drew said, I think that, like, for instance, some of the guidance that we have right now, like in the NIST AI RMF, you know, a lot of it is voluntary to begin with, but also kind of speaks to that piece of different risk in different sectors and different applications. So I think that yeah, just to agree with Drew that there will probably be a range even within cyber, from like the self-driving cars to aviation examples, and for mission critical infrastructure kind of situations, it might be something that is deployed very minimally or not at all, and I think that's okay in a lot of contexts too.
So I think that kind of answer one question, but just to make sure that it's clarified. Someone asked, are the findings and recommendations the same across domains? And is there any specific conclusion on cyber defense method, depending on the field, for example, medical field versus military? And it seems like, based on what you just said, that the answer would be yes, right?
I think we would lean that way, but I think that's a piece for future research for us. We didn't actually get to that level of depth of going into like sector specific, but yeah. Drew, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that we'll end up there, but I think that right now the field is still small enough, and that it's just about building the capability and then understanding where it can and cannot be applied.
Thank you. We also had a question concerning data. So someone mentioned that a recent CNAS report, CNAS, report pointed out gaps in access to data, and that's one of the most serious challenge for AI, and that's true across all the different fields, and I feel it's even truer in cybersecurity. But apparently the expert interview ranked that pretty low. So how should we think about this problem?
Well, I think that data is going to, so there are a couple of different things to say here. One is reinforcement learning trains differently than most other AI systems. Reinforcement learning basically creates its own data while it's doing the process. So that's what the gyms and the simulations do, is they run the game, and the game is the data that you train the model on. And so in a sense that it creates its own data. In a different sense, you need a lot of data to understand how to make that game accurate and realistic. You need a lot of data to understand whether the agent is performing how you might want it to. But I actually might turn this question back to our moderator, who might have a few thoughts on data access.
Yeah, I don't pretend I have the answer. I think you're right that one of the advantage of reinforcement learning is that as the agent acts, it kind of generates new data and new observations that the agent is able to leverage. I think most of the meat will be in defining the observation space, and that will kind of be the upper bound on the amount and the quality and depth of data that is required to have relevant predictions. So it's kind of shifting the question a little bit. I know I'm cheating, but I feel like reinforcement learning being its own machine learning technique, it's not like having more and more and more gazillions of data, but more how do we present the observation to the agent in a meaningful way that is contextualized enough so the agent can learn from it. Hopefully that answers the question. We have kind of two questions that are slightly related in terms of developing these capabilities and also building and running a gym. One question is that, what exactly does it cost to build and run a gym? Is it just cloud computing or something more? And the follow-up question is it seems that these things are very expensive because you have to have the whole infrastructure. So do you think that industries or just having the financial resources will be able to develop this solution? Or do you see more a generalization across the board of people having more access to cheaper options to implement these kind of methods?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. It's a big, complicated question. Right now, the cage agents that we saw out there, we were able to train them in between 3 and 20 hours on a single GPU, a single cloud processor. That's kind of the scale we're at today. That's accessible to anybody who wants to take a run at it. It's not exactly free, but it's also not that big. They're starting to cross that threshold. The Pacific Northwest National Labs gyms that they just put out was designed to run at a slightly larger scale, maybe 4 of these GPUs. And as you start to get to larger and larger GPUs, you get more and more expense. Now, with regular AI, something like GPT-3 or GPT-4 that was said to cost $100 million to train. In that case, what you're doing is training just training the model. You have the data. In this case, a lot of the cost, maybe even the dominant cost, is in running the simulation, not just training the model. You have to do both of those things, and so that can jump your costs up. But we're not anywhere near the GPT-4 levels of networks at this point. And so where we are now, I think it's accessible to anybody with a research lab and a passion. at some point, we might get to much bigger models that are more involved. But we should note that if you're going to be, if you need to run these agents quickly, or if you need to run them on the vulnerable networks themselves, then they can't even be that big, because that would be too draining to operate. And so there's almost a limit to how far we even want to scale these up to be more expensive. I won't turn this one back to our moderator because it might be proprietary. But
no, I think you covered it great. Like, I don't have anything to add. Yeah, I think you said it all. Thank you. I don't know if Krystal, you want to add something to that?
I definitely agree. And I think that there's a lot of hope at this point for like being able to develop this technology by many different people. One of the reasons, like I mentioned in the presentation, that we were really interested in this space is just because of the plethora of open source tools. And so it really still is at the stage of early development where I think that a lot of people can get involved and the tools are freely accessible. So.
Yeah, thank you. We have a slightly technical question about reward functions. So you mentioned that, like defining reward functions is a very challenging task. It's like an open area of research. What are some of the approaches you think we might like leverage to approach this problem?
Drew, you're on mute.
Yeah.
I was going to let you take all the hard questions. That was my strategy here. So
yeah, I was saying I'm mute to see if I can get you to go. Not actually, it was my own mistake. So this is obviously a question that deciding on the reward function is probably going to be an organization by organization issue to contend with. Like, everyone's going to have their own preferences, and it might not even exactly be organization. It might be personality dependent. Some new CISO comes in and they say, "Oh, I think that we have this all wrong," and it might change over time as some sort of breach happens and they change their priorities. So that might require training different models as your priorities change, which could be a bummer. One place that I would look, though, to not be just punting on this question is capture the flag competitions have scoring. They have to determine a winner at the end, and they take some of these things into account. They have to decide how many points do you get for keeping people out of your network? How many points do you get for keeping your network up? And so, to the extent that you agree or disagree with whatever scoring system is, you can try to adapt those to model your reward function after.
yeah, and just not to be a pessimist, but I definitely think that the reward function problem is one of the hardest technical challenges that we identified. I definitely think, like Drew said, there are some approaches or examples that we can learn from in the human case for making these, but being able to really ensure that your agents align with the actual objectives that you wanted it to take is going to take a lot of research and trial and error in that space. So Melody, I didn't know if you had any other thoughts from your research or work on this.
Yeah, if I can throw my 2 cents, I agree that the alignment problem is huge. And I believe one viable approach could be to explore inverse reinforcement learning, because we have a lot of, what we have in security is a lot of amazing people who know this domain so well and have a lot of domain knowledge. And doing that, we can leverage all these skills and make the agent really learn from experts without like having to learn the exact action, but basically like learn the reward and try to bridge the gap for this alignment problem. So I think that could be one viable approach to explore for sure, but it's a complicated question. Great, let me look at the questions. Yes, something related to this also kind of alignment problem. Is there any research regarding the transfer of simulation-based results to the real world, or maybe like emulation?
I haven't seen or maybe nothing's coming to mind about transferring from the simulation to the real world, but some of the results that I've seen are transferring from simulation to simulation. And it looks like we've still got a long way to go there in several of the results that I've seen, even from same simulation, but different attacker. And so if you have two different attacker techniques, you're trained on one and a new attacker comes in and is using a different technique, then the defenses might not be so good. And so in this Cage 2 competition that we did so much looking into, a common approach was to train an agent against each individual attacker, and then have an initial flag to detect which agent or which attacker is running at any time, and say, oh, this looks like attacker number one. Let's use our defense, our model that was trained against attacker number one, and leave out the other. So there'd be a whole different set of defense agents that were trained for specific attackers, which I'm not sure is the most scalable. That's not the approach that I would have preferred to have seen, but it was effective here. And then if you change the environment, then you end up having a similar issue. In fact, many of the approaches that I saw weren't even able to adapt to a change in the environment. If you added a new endpoint, then they would have had to completely retrain their network. It was trained for 10 computers, and it doesn't know what to do with 11 or 9. Those are solvable problems, but they still need to be solved.
Yes, thank you. So we had a question also about, so operational risk is a factor, specifically that includes humans in terms of skills and competencies where it plays an important role. So how to improve skills and competencies to prevent impact of cyber attacks in such a competitive world?
Yeah, one of the things I think has been really interesting to see in the past couple of years is more cybersecurity and kind of machine learning graduate programs, training programs. And I think this kind of just speaks to the fact that in our big data world, people with those kind of skills are needed in just about every single field, and definitely in cybersecurity. So I think that, having cybersecurity programs, trainings, workshops, what have you, that also let people experiment with kind of what is happening in the machine learning field, having companies that give some resources or time to their employees to be able to upskill in this way or try to implement new products would be really valuable, because these technologies outside of just the domain that we're talking about in reinforcement learning have a lot of applications across all kinds of cybersecurity issues and challenges. So I think that the meshing of these two fields has been really interesting to see. Obviously, that's what we work on here at the Cyber AI project, but it's nice to see it expanding in the education domain as well.
Yeah, there's something that I've been kind of struck by. But from a policy perspective, we can look in and see AI and cyber. Those are computer things, and people know about computer things, know about those. But when you really dig into it, it can be astonishing how separate those worlds are. That cyber people know about cyber but don't know about AI, and AI people know about AI but don't know about cyber. And there aren't that many people who really know about both. People like Melody here are kind of a rare breed. And I think that in order to progress this field and to be able to get AI implemented well in cyber and to protect our AI systems as well, we're going to need more people who bridge that gap like Melody does.
Yes, so kind of like this also bridging the gap in terms of skills and everything. The Biden administration recently has increased pressure on private sector to take more responsibility for the security of the products. And often companies, they can't afford to keep up, in terms of people or there's resources. So do you think open sourcing the tools you described will help raise the bar to just have broader digital ecosystem and help create a better baseline for security across the board?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. The hope is that in a few or 10 years or something, we will be there, and that will help lighten the burden for some of these companies. But I think that right now these technologies are too early days to be able to help against this this pressure.
I would largely agree with that, and not to say something like very generic in the information security space, but I really think like information, tool sharing, you know, those kinds of basic things are so vital for like meeting that challenge. I think that the executive order really speaks to the need for organizations to kind of do those kinds of things. And so like I hope for this specific tool, reinforcement learning for cyber defense, that people are encouraged to continue to create open projects. That would be really great to see, especially if some of those came out of like more companies as well, who have a different understanding than from the academic or government side of what the modern attacks look like and what a viable product in that space would look like as well. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Someone asked, do you have any views on how the field could offer the US geostrategic opportunities, perhaps strengthen established Five Eyes link, but create nurture new cooperation with value-aligned nations and organizations to aid in countering hostile state activity?
Sure, there are a lot of parts to that question potentially. I think that you can start by taking a look at how who are developing these tools and how they're being spread around. The tools in that list that Krystal showed, the cyborg one that we spent most of our time on was a Five Eyes effort that was led by Australia. The US has a couple, the one from PNNL and one from NSA and MITRE. Canada had one on that list. The UK has one, Yawning Titan. And so I think that there is a lot of work spreading these around. I think there's also been a lot of international collaboration in understanding what these tools can be and should be. There's a NATO working group that made a lot of headway in conceptualizing these as a collective. So I think understanding what these tools should do and what they should be capable of at this early stage is a place for a lot of that coordination. And I think that actually a fair amount of it is already happening.
Yeah, I definitely want to see the US and their allies leverage these types of technologies, but I think one thing that was important to kind of highlight in our report and also our conception of this going forward was really as a public good or, you know, a public service technology. So while I think there are certainly probably numerous applications for the US, kind of the defense sector. I also think that, you know, these kinds of tools would be good for your everyday enterprise as well. Also speaking to, you know, the fact that they also suffer attacks from nation state actors, what have you, but really hoping that this becomes like a rather widely spread and widely used technology for the common good too.
Thank you. And can you speak to the issue of sorry, that's a hard word for me, operationalization and governance of AI models?
So I'll just really briefly say, you know, one of the things that we did in our report was kind of go a little bit more in depth on those autonomy levels that I think Drew highlighted a bit at the end of the presentation. And, you know, we talked about kind of impact of errors and complexity of action. And so I think that like various initial efforts to come up with risk matrices, kind of controls and processes for these is kind of the intersection between now I'm having difficulty with the word, operating these technologies and also governance as well.
I'm sorry. Great, and I think we have one last question, which is still related to this transferability problem from like simulation to real world settings. So what do you think is needed to solve this problem? Is that like resources, redefining tasks? What is like as really the core of the issue we should explore to make that like possible?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think that we're probably going to need to start is on relatively small networks. And so rather than getting these huge enterprises, Google scale enterprises or Apple scale enterprises, probably start in like a smaller thing that has 10 devices. But then we need to get to be more realistic. And so there, I would say finding some good example networks that are at that scale to model and build these competitions after. And then I think that the maybe the biggest difference is, or need, is getting realistic attackers and realistic benign signals. So that might require some data sharing about how do attackers really behave in here, and what are possible routes.
Yes, and someone just asked, like, if you work with like many small to medium defense companies and they have like limited resources and money, is there any free tools or like resources, website, or you recommend where such company can learn more?
Absolutely. There are a bunch of free resources. You can go download this Cyborg Gym right now, or you could download the Cyber Battle Sim that Microsoft put out, and several of the trained agents are available on GitHub that you can go and download. I believe our report links in the references to all of the tools that we used or drew from. So if you're looking for a compendium, I think you can start at our report.
Thank you. I'm looking at the links. I just posted the Cyborg one. I'm going to try to find the Cyber Battle Sim one. In the meantime, is there any other questions? Okay. If not, thank you very much to the speakers for their conversation. And we will now welcome Danny back for some closing remarks. And I'm going to find those links.
Great, excellent presentation all. And I'd like to thank our speakers, Drew and Krystal, and Melody for moderating today's program. Particular thanks to Drew and Melody, who woke up early to join us from the West Coast. So thank you for an early and engaging conversation. Thanks to all of you for taking part in this discussion and for your comments and questions. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and research updates. We'll be taking a summer break, but stay tuned for updates on our next event when we return to our regular programming later in the fall. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Enjoy your weekends.